Guys, on the bench today, we've got the brand new Hobao Hyper TT 2.0, and this is unlike anything I've looked at in a long time. This is a super low-slung truggy and reminds me a lot of the Arrma Talion. On top of that, this thing is filled with some super premium looking parts. I cannot wait to dig into this thing. And assuming it survives normal bashing, we're gonna EXP this thing with some upgrade parts, more power, and bigger tires. But of course, before we do that, we gotta see what this thing's made of. And first of all, I wanna say this body looks really, really nice. It's a little funky looking from the front, but from the side, top, and back, it looks really good. And whereas this paint's a little bit thin, it does look really nice in this blue. The body itself is medium thickness. I would say it's a little bit thinner than we're expecting to see from modern bashers today. So I'll be curious to see how this thing holds up to some abuse. Under the body is where things get really interesting. This is a super premium looking truck straight out of the box. We've got a ton of aluminum, a really nice double center brace, all metal threaded body shocks with cap protectors, a really nice machine chassis. This thing's got a center differential and overall looks really, really nice. The only thing I'm a little bit concerned about is this power system. This is a pretty small motor and only a 60 amp ESC. I'm definitely curious to see just how powerful this feels off-road and if this motor overheats. This little truggy does have a center differential. Let's take a look at that first. By removing these cable management zip ties, we are able to take this center brace and lift it straight up, so it doesn't need to be completely removed. You can see we did expose the Dean's connector. I really wish they'd stop using Dean's connectors on these cars. With this small power system, it's probably okay, but very few people are still using these. And at minimum, I'd like to see an XT60 here. Pulling this top cover off gives us our first look at the center differential. As you can see here, we do have a steel spur gear, and the center differential is directly connected to the rear differential. This could be good or it could be bad. Let's see if we can remove this center differential right now. Unfortunately, no, because of this direct connection, it's kind of trapped in here. So we're gonna have to remove this motor mount in order to get it out. Now, if you're not familiar with Hobao, they do make very premium products. They've been in the business for a long time. And even though they aren't that well known in the US, trucks like their MTX show, they can really make an awesome basher. That being said, I just noticed a couple of things. First of all, unfortunately, this differential is still trapped in here. Another thing I noticed, which I'm a little disappointed in, is this motor is loose. If I hadn't taken a look at this, we probably would have ended up stripping these gears. Obviously, this is not a problem with the car itself, but a manufacturing problem, but it's a problem nonetheless. Fortunately, the entire rear bulkhead comes off with just 4 screws. And now that we can pull that away, we have access to our center differential. This center differential itself looks really good. We have a machined Mod 1 spur gear, nice thick looking output cups, sealed bearings, and a plastic housing. Internally, we can see this is a sealed differential. These are sintered steel gears, and we've got a little bit of fluid in here that felt pretty thin, so I'm gonna add just a little bit of thicker fluid to this because that's how I like to bash. We're not gonna go crazy with earplugs on this. I'm just gonna put some 1 million in because this is a speed truggy and I don't wanna mess up the handling too much. This fluid's pretty thick, so we're just gonna scoop a little bit out of the bottle, scrape it off in there, and that should be just fine. Something I've noticed about differential fluid is that it's not linear in how it locks up the differential. For instance, 1 million fluid is not going to be 10 times as locked up as 100K fluid. And that feels pretty good to me. While we've got this rear module apart, is a great time to take a closer look at it. You can see we've got some pretty low-slung pin tires, some really thick-looking solid arms, aluminum ABCD blocks, adjustable upper links, an aluminum rear shock tower, and a nice-looking wing back there. You can see we've also got a sway bar and steel dog bones in the rear, as well as CVDs in the front. Let's take a closer look at the suspension. These tires are definitely doing a lot of the heavy lifting on the low-slung nature of this truck. I'm really curious to see how it's going to handle differently with bigger tires on it, and if this drivetrain is going to be able to handle those bigger tires. Wheel nuts are nylock style, but not serrated. If you're curious about how these nylock style nuts work, basically there's just a piece of plastic that's embedded in the end of the nut, and that plastic doesn't have threads in it from the factory, so when you screw it onto a bolt, it creates threads in there, and that tension on those created threads are what hold the nut on. Though most manufacturers also use serrated nuts these days, I'll be curious to see if these hold on their own. These tires look pretty good. They're very light. They're a classic pin style. However, whereas the rubber is pretty thin and squishy, they don't actually feel that soft. So hopefully these pins won't get worn down too quickly. We've got a pretty standard looking rear hub setup. And if we pull this hex off, it's a standard 12mm hex. We can see we've got a steel stub axle. And one thing I noticed was that these pins are pretty far out on the stub axle, which means that standard 17mm or extended hexes probably aren't going to work on here without including some kind of spacer to prevent this from getting pushed in when you have the wheel on and you're running it. You can see just how deep the slot is on these hexes. For a small 1/10 scale vehicle, these shocks look pretty premium. We can see we've got shock shaft protectors here. This is an all metal body with a metal adjustable collar, and then a hybrid metal plastic cap. I really like these hybrid caps. They tend to be really strong, and with a little bit of flexibility in the top of them, they usually don't get bent or broken. And pulling off this hybrid plastic aluminum cap, we can see we've got a standard bladder style shock in here. Bladder style shock is fine for bashing. However, I will note that it seems like a lot of manufacturers are going to an emulsion style shock, which seems to be somewhat better at handling the rebound when you land big jumps. Fluid in here feels medium thick, and these shocks feel nice and smooth. Unfortunately, to get into this differential, it does look like quite a bit of disassembly is going to be required. This does feel like a fairly old design where we'll have to remove the shock tower, the D-block, and as you can see from this tab here, this would have to be removed from the chassis in order to get this apart. This guy does come with sway bars front and rear, which also have to be removed in order to get this differential out. This design definitely does feel a little bit antiquated in some respects, and having to go through all of this just to get a differential out does feel like a little bit more work than really is necessary. Fortunately, if this thing actually is really, really durable, you won't have to work on it too often. Like any self-respecting race car, this does have adjustable pills. These are able to be moved around inside the blocks, and that allows you to adjust your toe angle. And in my experience for bashing, these are actually really nice because not only are they adjustable, which you may or may not care about, but they help absorb energy better than a just aluminum on steel interface, and if they get damaged, they're a lot cheaper to replace. This is a little weird. We've got one Phillips screw in this entire car. It's not a big deal when we see something like this, but having this one Phillips screw kind of makes the whole thing feel a little bit cheaper. And that's not a good thing because this is not a cheap car. You do seem to get a lot for your money, but it is quite a bit of money. We'll talk about that in just a minute. And with that apart, we can finally get all of this apart and get a look at our rear differential. This rear differential is using straight cut, sintered steel gears, and hopefully there's fluid inside here. Let's find out. Come on, no grease. And yes, Hobao did put fluid in the front and rear differentials. That's really nice to see. We've had a few manufacturers lately that haven't done that, and it's pretty disappointing. That being said, these gears look fairly small, so I'll be curious to see if this thing holds up to big tires and 4S power. Well guys, that was quite a bit to take apart just to get to the rear differential. There were a few things you could probably skip, but most of this would be necessary to get it removed. I'm gonna go ahead and put all this back together. Then I saw something cool in the electronics we need to take a look at. We're gonna have to pause here because we need to address this loose motor, and I think this motor is loose for a very specific reason, and that's because, yeah, there is 0 thread locker on here, and this isn't the only place I found that. The screws that mount the aluminum motor mount to the chassis also had no thread lock on them, and the grub screws for the sway bar had no thread lock on them. I did check the pinion gear, and it appears to be thread locked, as does the input cup on the rear differential. However, because of what I found here, you're probably gonna need to go through yours and make sure that everything that goes into aluminum is thread locked. Fortunately, even though there is quite a bit of aluminum on here, not that many things go into aluminum. Okay, so I was wrong. You will have to remove this motor mount in order to take this out because the gear goes down into the notch in the chassis, and you can't assemble this without being able to put that in that notch first. Oh, we'll just take this back apart again. If you enjoy watching me learn everything the hard way so you don't have to, make sure you get subscribed because we do full teardowns on every new vehicle we get. Now that we've got the center differential installed, we can go ahead and get this mesh set before we reinstall this rear module. I think you might be able to get to these screws with the rear module in, but it's easier to see and easier to adjust with it out. I have a full video on how to adjust mesh, but it's actually very simple. All you need to do is get your gears as close together as possible without them actually binding. A lot of people think you need to have more backlash in the gears than you actually do. If you look up the specification for Mod 1 gears, you'll find that the backlash spec is only about 3/1000ths of an inch, and that's smaller than the width of a human hair. You can hear that click between the gears. That's plenty of backlash. And if I just go around and check that in several different places, as long as I have that amount of backlash all the way around, it's always going to change around the circumference of the gears just because of manufacturing tolerances. But as long as we have that backlash, we're good to go. We can tighten these up. Once you're done tightening, always double check because tightening the screws can change the backlash. This feels pretty good. And then of course, don't forget to take everything all the way back apart again to put in your center drive shaft. You wanna make sure you put it all together, then have to take it back apart again. Doing it in the correct order is just a little bit too convenient. While I've got this out, why don't we go ahead and upgrade this drive shaft to this really nice aluminum one. We're not gonna wanna run aluminum when we put 4S in this thing, so let's try it out now. Whenever you take things apart that deal with the mesh, such as these motor mounts, you definitely wanna go back in and verify that the mesh is good. Even though it shouldn't, the mesh can change, and especially if your mesh is particularly tight, you can end up with binding and not know it. This still feels fine. One thing I've noticed over the years is that when you screw plastic into aluminum, it doesn't seem nearly as necessary to use thread locker, and I believe that's because whereas the plastic doesn't work as a perfect analog to that nylock nut we were talking about earlier, when you tighten down on the plastic, it does compress it and add some pre-tension to it, which tends to help hold it together. Last thing we need to do before we bash this thing is take a look at the electronics. This is a pretty interesting setup. It's got a fairly small motor, and this 60 amp Hobbywing ESC, which is the 10BL60, is smashed in right behind it, which means we might struggle to put longer motors in here unless we actually take the ESC and mount it back there, which we might take a look at in a future video. For this ESC, Hobao is nice enough to give you a program card. Nobody else gives you a program card in the box, and this is a really nice value add. In front of those, we have a Metal Gear servo. I'm curious to see if there's any waterproofing on this servo, because it looks like we might have a little bit of a secret in this receiver box. And it looks like we're gonna have to check out this receiver box in order to get this servo out anyway, so let's take a closer look at this. They did manage to sneak one dreaded 1.5mm screw in here. So the secret I was talking about is that this actually has a gasket where these wires run out. And whereas there's no actual gasket on the top of this, it does have some lips on it that make it look fairly well sealed. I'm wondering if this receiver box might even be a little bit water resistant. This receiver box houses a 3-channel FHSS receiver. And to go along with that, we've got a pretty standard 3-channel Hobao radio. It's got a foam wheel, digital trims, endpoints, steering dual rate, what you'd expect for an RTR radio. And now that we're able to get this servo out of here, let's see if they use Threadlock on the servo horn. It does not seem like they do, but again, we're screwing into a plastic piece here, so it might be okay. Interestingly, the Hobao site shows a brass output gear for the servo. This is clearly steel, so they upgraded at some point. Right off the bat, we can see we don't have O-rings on the screws. We can see we also do not have an O-ring on the bottom cover, so this thing is not going to be waterproof. There are ways to waterproof these servos. Let me know down in the comments if you're interested in seeing some of those old school methods. Pulling the top off, we can see this is an all steel gear train, which is pretty nice. There's even a metal bushing up here in the top case, which you don't usually see on budget servos. One thing to note is even if a servo isn't specifically made waterproof, because of its inherent design, they're always a little bit water resistant. So minor splashing and stuff like that probably isn't going to bother this, which of course we're going to find out because I'm sure I'll end up washing this car. Speaking of design, this battery tray looks pretty good. It has an adjustable rear stop, and the entire battery tray is movable front to back for adjusting your weight and balance. Up here at the front, we have a pretty nice looking servo saver system with a lot of aluminum bits and a good, if not fairly standard design. All right, guys, she's all back together. Let's get this beautiful body on here, see what she can do in stock form. Yeah, she got some pep. I don't expect it to be too fast. That's reasonably quick. This grass is pretty tall. Let's give her one more pass. All right, let's see what that was. All right, 31 miles an hour. That is not too bad for such a low-slung car in tall grass. Let's see how she bashes. Well guys, so far I'm pretty impressed with this little guy. It handles really well on the ground, though it doesn't jump very well, and I actually broke it on the second jump landing. Something happened with this servo and servo horn. I suspect the servo horn stripped and got jammed back. That's not a problem though, because we're gonna be replacing all of these electronics in a minute, which is gonna be a good thing because air control didn't feel very good with these small tires and lower power. I'm gonna be upgrading both the motor and the ESC. I'm not exactly sure where we're gonna end up putting the ESC as there isn't a lot of room on here, and I think with the longer motor we might run into clear clearance issues, but we'll just have to wait and see. I'm definitely curious to see how this platform is going to handle more power. I'm hoping that they don't have this small motor and ESC in here because the platform can't handle the stress of higher power, because I definitely think it'll be more fun with more power. Of course, we're going to find the limits because that's what we do on this channel. I will say though, I definitely feel like this is a little 1/10 scale Talion. It's got that monster buggy feel to it where it handles really well like a buggy, but has a little bit more ground clearance like a monster buggy does. This power system is reasonably adequate, but I want to EXP this thing, so we're going to go with this Castle motor and this Hobbywing 120 amp ESC. Not sure if they're going to fit though. Now that we've got those out of there, let's see if this ESC and motor are going to fit in here next to each other. It's going to be a tight squeeze, but it looks like we can get these in here. Before we get that installed, let's go ahead and swap out this servo. To replace it, we're going to go with this absolute beast of a Pro Modeler servo. This should have plenty of power and speed to turn these much bigger tires. I was going to swap out this drive shaft for the original steel one, but let's see how aluminum holds up to some bigger power. So it turns out if you remove this upper link, you can access these screws and actually completely remove and install a motor without taking anything else apart. That's handy. I'd also say this is probably one of the easiest motor mounts to set mesh on. Both times I've said it now, it's been really straightforward. But now for the real challenge, will this ESC actually fit? And it looks like, yes, it will. Let's get it stuck down. All right, so that's about as tight as it could get. And that's with a 63mm long Castle motor. And your total length here is about 100mm. If the ESC didn't fit there, you could probably mount it back here in this back corner as well. I'm gonna go ahead and get this tidied up. Then let's see what those bigger tires look like. Well, there we go, guys. That looks a little bit more serious. Now we've got a few more upgrades to install before we bash. That includes these stiffer springs, which will just quickly get installed. Some nice locking aluminum hexes. Though I think for the purposes of this video, we're gonna skip the carbon fiber because I wanna see what this chassis can really handle in stock form. Now I know these tires are a massive jump up in size, but as the saying goes, go big and go home. I'm already home, so the only thing left to do is go big. Well, guys, she definitely looks like a beast now. Let's get a 4S battery in this thing and see how it performs. Well, guys, after all that thrashing, I finally had a failure. That's right. I lost a body clip. Seriously though, there really isn't much to say about this. Everything is absolutely perfect. Nothing is bent, nothing broke, nothing came apart, and I'm running double the power, and these tires are at least twice as heavy as the stock tires. So it turns out I was wrong. This isn't the 1/10 scale Talion that Arrma never built. This is the 1/10 scale Talion EXB that Arrma never built. This feels like a pretty good combination, though it probably would be fine on 3S. Bigger tires are awesome, though these tires are probably a little bit too big. And overall, other than some issues with repairability, this thing's a really awesome little truck. I was definitely doing things out there to it that it was never designed for. This thing is almost certainly not tested to go 15 feet in the air doing triple backflips. The RTR is $399, and that's quite a bit of money, though you do get quite a bit of car for it, but they make a roller that's $279. And since I think you'll want to change out the electronics anyway, especially if you got some electronics laying around, this thing's going to be hard to beat for value. Obviously, that's just my experience. Everyone's going to have a different experience with these things, but at least in my experience, this is a tough, good handling car that just needs a few upgrades to make it really, really awesome. And by a few upgrades, I don't mean any of the ones that I put on here. Those weren't necessary. It's fine without them. Though the upgraded springs are nice for landing big jumps. All right, guys, let me know what you think about this down in the comments. Make sure you're subscribed, then check out one of these videos.